Thanks for joining me on today's video Bible study. My name is Ryan Goodwin. I preach for the East Shelby Church of Christ in Collierville, Tennessee. If you have any questions or comments, then please leave them in the comment section below. Or if you have any other spiritual needs, then we'd love to hear from you. Find us at eastshelby.com. In our first few studies, we looked at chapters 1 and 2 of the New Testament book of Colossians. We're going to be looking at chapter 3 today. But before I get into chapter 3, I want to sum up a few of the things that we've considered already. In Colossians chapter 1, the Apostle Paul has begun to build this grand theological argument about Jesus Christ. That Jesus Christ is not a sub-God or partial deity. That even though Jesus came to be as a human being and to live as a human being with all those limitations, He was also God at the same time. He establishes this fact in chapter 1, beginning in verse 15, where he says, "And He," speaking of Jesus, "is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation," not the first one created or the first thing born of the creation, but the one who holds the place as firstborn. He has the authority of the firstborn son in the household of God. By Him, it says in verse 16 of Colossians 1, by Him all things were created both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions, rulers or authorities. All things have been created by Him and for Him. He goes on to say in verse 18 that He is also head of the body, the church. He's the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that He Himself might come to have first place in everything. Now, Paul reminds us down in verse 23 that there's a responsibility that we have to continue in the faith, to not be drawn away from the true and pure gospel by empty human philosophy. Now, he's dealing with some of the philosophers of his own time. We start to see the beginnings and around the middle of the first century of an idea called Gnosticism. And that's the idea that because all flesh is inherently corrupted and the spirit is elevated, or God is elevated above the flesh, then that means one of two things. Either Jesus didn't really come in the flesh and He just kind of looked like a human being, or it means that when the Son of God, the Christ, came to earth and dwelt in a human body, He left that Christhood behind. Essentially, the Gnostic is saying that deity and humanity cannot coexist in the same form. He confronts that in the thesis statement of his book in Colossians 2. And I really do believe that you can sum up the main argument that he's making in this statement in Colossians chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, where it says, "For in Him all the fullness of deity dwells in bodily form, and in Him you have been made complete, and He is the head over all rule and authority." You notice here that He wasn't just a sub-deity or just a sampling of deity. He wasn't a little bit of God dwelling in a human form. He is the fullness of deity, everything that it means to be deity, dwelling in a human body. Now, when we looked at that a few lessons ago, I acknowledged that I don't fully understand how that works. I can't comprehend with my limited human mind how deity in all of its fullness and all of its glory can dwell in a human body. I look at my own body and think, for as healthy and as young as I am, I don't know how you could possibly stick the fullness of deity, everything that it means to be God, all the glory, all the power, and to put that into this form. I just don't understand that. But there are some things about God that we have to accept are beyond our comprehension. In fact, Paul the Apostle even mentions that back in the book of Ephesians. And by the way, we've talked about this before. Ephesians and Colossians have a lot of common ground. They overlap with each other a great deal. But it says here in Ephesians chapter 3 and in verse 17, "So that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, and that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ, which surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled up to all the fullness of God." Same phrase there, fullness, right? The fullness of deity, the fullness of God. This is a knowledge that goes beyond normal human comprehension. And so if you were a Greek philosopher of the first century, you might think the gospel was ridiculous. Paul even mentions that in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, that to the Greek, the gospel concept is just, it's silly, it's idiotic, it's a stupid concept. And so if you were living by pure worldly wisdom or worldly standards, if you were trying to appraise and understand things in just a worldly way, you're probably never going to get it then. You're never going to understand the deeper meaning of the gospel message. Now again, typical of many of Paul's letters, the first half of the book is very grand and sweeping. It deals with establishing these large theological concepts. And then the second half of the book is typically more practical in its application. You see that in Romans, you see it in Galatians, and you see it here in Colossians as well. So let's begin here in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 1. If then you have been raised up with Christ, keep seeking the things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on the things above, not on the things that are on earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory. So this first phrase, if you have been raised up with Christ, I think is hearkening back to the idea of baptism. We saw this back in Colossians 2, where it says in verse 12 of Colossians 2, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised up with him through faith in the working of God, who raised him from the dead. So if you have been raised up with Christ, to me that phrase is baptism. Now I know the word baptism is not in Colossians 3 verse 1, but when you see that kind of terminology applied in one context, referring to baptism, and now in Colossians 3:1, that same terminology, you can't help but make the logical connection there. So if you're going to make a claim to being raised up with Christ, if you're going to make a claim to being a saved person, if you are going to make the claim that you have a new life in Jesus Christ and that the old life has died, there's something that's contingent upon us. If you have been raised up with him, you need to keep seeking Christ. You can't stop. You can't rest on your laurels or rest on reputation. The Christian life is one of constantly seeking, of growing, of maturing. Wherever you are now as a Christian is not where you should be tomorrow or the day after or 10 years or 50 years from now. And I think maybe just as a really practical question for us to consider is, look back on your life as a Christian and where you are now versus 10 years ago or whatever applies to you. If you haven't really grown in 10 or 20 years as a Christian, maybe it's time to wonder what's wrong. If you haven't grown as a Christian in 10 or 20 years, then what have you been doing this whole time? If your level of Bible knowledge has basically stayed the same for the last decade, if your prayer life is basically what it was 10 years ago, if your level of commitment and involvement in the church is, again, basically what it was 10 years ago, you haven't really grown. In fact, you've just sort of stayed the same. And if you're not growing, that's a sign of a real spiritual problem. If then you have been raised up with Christ, you need to keep seeking the things above. Keep seeking Christ. Keep striving. Christianity is aspirational in nature, and that's very different from the philosophers of Paul's own day. As a point here, dying to sin and being raised up with Christ, these are things that are required for salvation, but the philosophers and the self-worshipers that were mentioned at the end of Colossians 2 that we studied last time, they were people that only went through the motions. They believed that as long as they went through the motions, that maybe through punishing their bodies or practicing some kind of strict level of self-discipline, that they could then achieve some amazing spiritual standard. Now, they went through the motions. They did the superficial exterior acts. They looked like great philosophers. They seemed like great thinkers. They appeared on the outside to be deeply devoted, deeply disciplined followers of God. But they weren't seeking Jesus Christ. They weren't. Coming to church and checking off a box is not the same thing as seeking Christ. Going through the motions of prayer, saying the same prayers before dinner, around the table with your family, saying the same prayers in the same way, with no motivation, with no joy, with no substance, that's not the same thing as seeking Christ. Just kind of having a ho-hum attitude about Bible study and being satisfied with just a very beginner or elementary level of Bible knowledge, that's not seeking Christ. It's not seeking Christ. Christ is above. Not literally, not physically, not geographically. Of course, He's not above us. Jesus isn't on the moon or in the stars or up in the clouds or anything. But Paul's point is, he's using this kind of locational terminology, right, to show us that Jesus Christ is above things of the earth. Jesus Christ is above worldly pursuits like your job or your career or your savings, your retirement, even your family, even your human relationships. Jesus Christ is above those things. So we've got to keep seeking those things that are above. It means that it's a continual process, that it is never over until we have joined Christ above, until we have fully committed our lives, till we have devoted ourselves, and we found ourselves at the full point of self-sacrifice, where we can speak, just as Paul the Apostle did, that my life is of no account, that this life now, I'm willing to give it up so that I can be with Christ, my Savior, my Lord, my very best friend. Keep our mind on heavenly things. But that's hard to do. Keeping your mind on heavenly things is very, very difficult. It's hard no matter where you are, whether you're rich or poor or anywhere in between. I think the world provides plenty of distractions for us. So when it says, set your mind on things above, not on things that are on the earth, you know what's hard about that? What's hard about that is I'm pretty much couched in earthly things almost all the time. My body might have an ache or a pain that's distracting me. My body might be hungry. My body might be sleepy. I'm distracted by my children, the needs of my spouse. I'm distracted by money, by the economy, by things in the news and politics. Like everywhere you look, all around you, how is it possible to keep your mind on things above when things of the earth are so all-consuming? Now, there's a couple of passages to consider. Proverbs chapter 30 points this out in verses 7 through 9. Let's go and read that real quick. In Proverbs chapter 30, verses 7 through 9, it says, 2 things I have asked of thee, don't refuse me before I die. Keep deception and lies far from me. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is my portion, lest I be full, and deny thee and say, well, who is the Lord? Or lest I be in want and steal and profane the name of my God. I think it's a great point the writer of Proverbs makes there is, it's not a matter of being rich or a matter of being poor. It's a matter of, am I focusing on God? I think the poor person might think, if I just had a little bit more money, then I could finally have the free time and the free mental energy to focus on God. If I just had a little bit more money, if I just had more in savings, if I could just get my bills paid, I'd finally be able to focus on God. I think a lot of rich people may be coming at it from the opposite perspective, surrounded by all these distractions, surrounded by wealth and abundance and stuff and your automobiles and your collections and all that sort of thing. I think a lot of rich people go, man, if I could only just simplify my life. If I could just simplify my life and live a simpler, cleaner life, I could finally have the ability to focus on God. I could give God the attention that I needed. If I wasn't so distracted by my career and my money and my big house, and just live that simpler life. To me, it's not about being rich or poor. It's about focusing on Jesus Christ. So that no matter what your economic status is, no matter what your age is, no matter what your health is, no matter what your family relationships are like, the focus is always on Christ. Then he uses a rather strange phrase in verses 3 and 4. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory. What does it mean that your life will be revealed? What does it mean that right now we're living some kind of hidden life, a mystery life? Well, if you have nothing but an earthly perspective on things, then this is your life. Your career is your life. Your family is your life. Your identity is your life. Whatever your name is, whatever your social security number is, whatever your race is, whatever your culture is, whatever your nationality is, this earthly existence is your life. But according to Colossians 3, there's something else about you that's your real life. The real you is hidden right now. And it will only be revealed when Christ is also revealed. You know what I like about this? And to me, this isn't meant to be some kind of like esoteric, mysterious kind of thing. This is supposed to be a very, very practical consideration that Paul is throwing out there. You, as you are right now, are not you the way you'll be for all eternity. I know I use the word you a lot there. I probably used up my allotment of that word for the day. I get it. But let me say that again. You, as you are right now, is not you for what you'll be for all eternity. I know we love our jobs. I know that we worry about money. I know that nationality and race and identity and all those kinds of things, they make up who we are right now. But you're going to be that for that long. And you're going to be a resurrected spirit being in the image of Christ for the rest of eternity. In the resurrection, we're not going to look exactly like this. Now, I don't know exactly what we'll look like. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 doesn't give us a ton of clues, but I know I'm not going to have the same limitations that I have now. And I know that in the resurrection, nationality is not going to be anything that has meaning. Revelation chapter 5 talks about how Christ's kingdom is made up of people from all nations and all languages and all nationalities and all tribes from all the earth. So nationality isn't going to matter in the resurrection. Whatever limitations I'm facing right now as far as susceptibility to illness or age or injury, those are not going to exist in whatever resurrected body I have. Here's my point. You are only going to be like this for so long, just a few short years on earth. If you live to be 80 or 85 or 90, what is 90 years compared to eternity? The real you, the spiritual, meaningful, substantial you is only going to be revealed when Jesus Christ is revealed as well. Your life right now is hidden. And so Christians walk the face of the earth appearing to be nothing special. I'm not anything special. I acknowledge that. I'm not good looking enough to be on the cover of a magazine. I'm not talented enough to win any kinds of awards. I'm not that special. I'm just a guy. And when you see me walking down the sidewalk, I just look like a guy. I'm just a guy, a regular guy. But in here, you know what I am? I'm a member of Christ's kingdom, a citizen of something heavenly. I am a saint, not a sinner. My life is hidden with Christ. and it will be revealed when he is also revealed in glory. Let's move on to the next section here in Colossians chapter 3. Let's pick up in verse 5. Colossians 3, verse 5. Therefore, consider the members of your earthly body as dead to immorality, to impurity, to passion, to evil desire and greed, which amounts to idolatry. For it is on account of these things that the wrath of God will come. And in them you also once walked when you were living in them. But now you also put them all aside, anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive speech from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, since you laid aside the old self with its evil practices, and have put on the new self, who is being renewed to a true knowledge according to the image of the one who created him. Verse 11. A renewal in which there is no distinction between Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave and freeman, but Christ is all and in all. You know, our definition of idolatry is often way too narrow. I like the way that idolatry is equated with greed here in verse 5. He says, and put away greed, which amounts to idolatry. I think sometimes we have this idea that idolatry only comes in the form of a fat-bellied golden statue sitting in your living room. But anything that you put above God, anything that is the object of your greed, of your covetousness, anything to where its desire supersedes your desire for God and for loving your neighbor as yourself, anything can be an idol. Oddly enough, even your own family can become an idol. As good as family is, and as important as a career is, as great as your reputation is, I mean, as morally neutral as things are here on planet Earth, anything can become an idol. And so I like this idea of greed, which amounts to idolatry. You have to put these things away. We need to put these things away from our lives, because sin is not something that you can just kind of like keep in your back pocket for a while. Like, sin is not something that you can just kind of discard, but you put it into a drawer somewhere in your house. You know, like old rememberies, old report cards or photographs, little things like from high school, like that puka shell necklace that you wouldn't be caught dead wearing anymore, but you still keep it in the back of your drawer in your bedroom. I know you've got one. We all have a puka shell necklace hiding somewhere in our lives. But sin is not something that you can just kind of take off and then set aside for later. Like, I just kind of keep that around for old time's sake, for whenever I want to thumb through it and think about the memories. You have to cast it aside. You have to get rid of sin. Consider the earthly members, consider the members of your earthly body as dead to immorality. They have to be dead to it, completely dead. And you don't keep dead things around. You don't keep dead things on your kitchen counter. You don't keep dead things in your pocket. Unless you're my 10-year-old son when he tries to catch every living creature in our backyard. But you don't keep dead things around. Consider yourself dead to immorality. Your earthly body, your hands, your eyes, your mouth, every tool and every implement that we put into the service of Satan needs to now be put in the service of God. And I like how all-encompassing this list is. I mean, this is a huge list of things. If you think that your sin is some kind of exception, Colossians 3 just bashes that in the head. Whatever sin you think you can get away with, the white lie or the relationship that our culture has embraced now, whatever sin you have in your life that you think is the exception to the rule, Colossians 3 deals with that. It is such an all-encompassing list. The immorality, the impurity, the passion, that's the idea of like lustful passion, like desiring things that you oughtn't desire. The greed, on account of these things, the wrath of God will come. Like, where's the excuse there? Where's the excuse? I know you think that you're special, but you're not. At least in the sense of sin. Let me make sure I'm clear about that. I know that you think that you can take your sin and say, well, I understand. I get it that murderers are going to hell. I get it that Adolf Hitler is going to hell and Joseph Stalin is going to hell. You know, nobody ever has a problem with the idea of Adolf Hitler going to hell, but we want that to be the line. Like, that's the benchmark. Like, Adolf Hitler is going to hell, and anybody who is at least a little better than Adolf Hitler is fine. I get that those kind of people are going to hell. But God wouldn't send me to hell for my sins. God wouldn't condemn me for what I'm doing. I'm not really that bad. It's on account of these things that the wrath of God will come. Not maybe or could come, but that the wrath of God will come. The old self and the new self cannot be more different. There's no overlap between the old self and the new self. For a parallel passage, you can consider Ephesians chapter 4, beginning in verse 17, going on to the end of that chapter. Even in chapter 5, really, the argument there is continued. But there in Ephesians 4, the Apostle Paul makes it clear that the old self and the new self, they could not be more different. Where the old self is calloused and broken and hardened and deceitful and lost, the new self is new. It's been born again. It's honest. It cares. It's compassionate. It's loving. It's deep rather than shallow and superficial. They are different lives. So your life as a sinner is different than your life as a saint. And in practical terms, make sure they look different. Like when you became a Christian, did your life pretty much just go on as normal? You got baptized, we all hugged you, there were some tears shed, we sang a song, we announced it the next Sunday, everything was great, and then your life just sort of went on like normal. When you became a Christian, did your life actually look different? Because he says we got to put away those sins. Whatever defined us when we were living a life of sin, hollow and shallow as it was, cannot define us any longer as Christians. Prejudice also has no place in God's kingdom. I love here in chapter 3 and verse 11, a renewal in which there is no distinction between Greek and Jew, between the circumcised and the uncircumcised, between the barbarian and the Scythian, the slave and the freeman. Christ is all, and Christ is in all. There's a couple other passages that you can consider. We don't have time to read all of them here. In Acts chapter 10 and verse 34, the Apostle Peter realizes after meeting Cornelius the centurion and kind of putting two and two together with a vision that God had shown him, Peter kind of puts two and two together and realizes, I understand now that God is not one to show partiality, but everybody in any nation, in all the earth, anybody and everybody who wants to seek Him through Jesus Christ is welcome to Him. There's no room for prejudice. Romans 2 verse 11, James chapter 2 as well. And I would also add in the book of Galatians, here's one that's not on your screen. In Galatians chapter 3, notice here in verse 27, Galatians 3:27, it says, "For all of you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor freeman, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." Let's move on to this last section here before we close for the day. In Colossians chapter 3, and I want to see here verses 12 through 17, and then we'll bring things to a conclusion here. In Colossians 3 and verse 12, "And so, as those who have been chosen of God, holy and beloved, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, bearing with one another and forgiving each other. Whoever has a complaint against anyone, just as the Lord forgave you, so also should you forgive each other." Verse 14, "And beyond all these things, put on love, which is the perfect bond of unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ richly dwell within you with all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another with psalms, with hymns and spiritual songs, singing with thankfulness in your heart to God. And whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks through him to God the Father. You're chosen as those who have been chosen. Now, this is not talking about individual predestination where God picked you out of a crowd and to the exclusion of everybody else said, I want that person to be saved. That's not what we're talking about here. You are chosen in the sense that when you become a Christian, you are a part of something that was eternally planned. You are part of something that was never a plan B or an accident or a happenstance. Christianity is God's great and glorious plan. The gospel was by design. The story of Jesus Christ, his life, his ministry, his preaching, his death, his burial, and his resurrection, that was all part of an age-old story. And you can become a part of something grand and eternal as well. As those part of a chosen generation, those part of a chosen kingdom, part of a chosen plan, you have to behave in a certain way. You don't just get to become a Christian and nothing changes. You don't get to just become a Christian and just go on living exactly how you've always lived, just like everybody else in the world, just like your neighbor, just like your sinful coworker, just like your sinful family member, just like the sinful you. You have to look different. Act different. At your core, in your heart, whatever you do in word or deed, it all needs to be done in the name of Jesus Christ. Look at this list in verses 12 and 13. Forgiveness, compassion, gentleness, humility. These are not traits that come very easily to us. They're not traits that come naturally to most people. So you might have to work really hard at them. Some effort needs to be involved in becoming the person that God knows and commands you to be. God believes that you can be a kind person, even if it doesn't come naturally to you. God believes that you can be a gentle person, even if gentleness doesn't come naturally to you. God believes you can be a forgiving person, even though in the heat of the moment, when you've been wronged by somebody, forgiveness is the last thing that you want to do. God believes that you can be all of these things. It's time to start living it. Now we're going to stop right there, and we'll pick up right around this place and make a few more applications when we get to our next Bible study. I want to thank you so much for your attention today. And as always, if you have questions or comments, leave them in the comment section. If you have any spiritual needs at all, reach out to the East Shelby Church of Christ, and we would love to sit down and have a Bible study with you, to pray with you, and to help you find the answers from God's Word that you've been looking for. And as always, my friends, have a blessed and wonderful day.